This afternoon, we are talking about angels supporting us in despair. This is chapter 4 of Father Gianni's book, Angels Support You in Despair, which is on page 46 of his work, Angels in the Bible and in Your Life. We begin with a question. Is there anyone here who can go out and pick me up a gallon of milk? If you had to pick me up a gallon of milk, what place comes to mind for you? You don't have to say anything out loud. Where would you pick up a gallon of milk for me? And how would you get there? Can you imagine the route in your mind? Okay, you need to take this road, then this road, and turn here or there. Probably what most of us have in common is if you needed to get a gallon of milk, we'd probably have various twists and turns in our journey. There's probably no straight line going from here to the gallon of milk. And isn't that true with life? I used to write a weekly column called El Pueblo Peregrino, the Pilgrim People, which talked about how it is that life is a pilgrimage. You know, we're sort of like going through life is like taking a walk or going on a trip where it's hardly ever, as Father Gianni says in this chapter, it's hardly ever linear. You know, we have a certain goal in mind and we think, okay, I'm just going to go from where I am to that goal, and things take us off track, right? We come up with all sorts of New Year's resolutions. Have we all made New Year's resolutions in our lives? Oh, this year I'm going to, right? We start the year thinking, I'm going to go from here to there. And then something comes up where months later, now that it's October, we find ourselves thinking, oh yeah, I remember when I made that resolution that I was going to do this or that this year or last year or the year before. And we ended up somewhere else. There's an interesting story in the Bible from the book of Genesis on a woman named Hagar. So Abraham was promised that Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as numerous as the sands on the seashore, a way for our ancient authors to articulate how it was that God was going to bless Abraham, even though Abraham and his wife Sarah were beyond the childbearing age. They were both old people. There was no way that either of them was going to have a child. Did you know the Guinness Book of World Record has the record for the world's oldest father? How old is the world's oldest father in the Guinness Book of World Records?
103.
Close. Unless you know more information than I. Last I checked, it was 96.
I just guessed.
So think about that for a moment. That's kind of incredible that a 96-year-old person could produce a child. Notice this 96-year-old person has the record for the world's oldest father. The world's oldest mother, I'm imagining, is much, much, much younger than that. Abraham found himself in that sort of situation where Abraham was advanced in age and was told that he was going to give birth to a numerous people, to a great nation. And he looked at his wife, and he was not going to be getting a great nation out of his wife. You follow me? She was past the childbearing age. And so his wife, Sarah, said, well, take my servant Hagar and do what you need to do with her, because if you're going to have a great nation, it ain't going to come from me. And so Abraham and Hagar did whatever Abraham and Hagar did, that Hagar ended up giving birth to Abraham's son. And you would think that that would be the end of the story, because now Abraham and Hagar gave birth, obviously, to a son, and it was through that child that perhaps Abraham could have descendants that were as numerous as the stars in the sky or as the sands on the seashore. Do you know where that story goes? Detour. 3 people come to visit Abraham. The scriptures lead us to believe that this is somehow God or spiritual visitors. So it's an instance that you could point to and suggest that these 3 people were angels in human form or God in human form. How interesting, the symbolism of 3 people coming to Abraham. Abraham provides them hospitality, and they tell him, when we come back and visit you next year, this time, Sarah will have born a child. Sarah laughed, which is why they named their son she laughed. Or in Hebrew, Isaac. Now this created a problem because Abraham and Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, had a son. Abraham's firstborn was not Isaac. Now, Abraham, his name was Ishmael. Oh, we'll come back to that. Now, Abraham and Sarah have a son, and his name was Isaac. And so now there becomes this tension, because in the ancient cultures, who was going to receive Abraham's blessing and his inheritance? The older son or the younger son? Obviously, the older son, the firstborn. The firstborn. So there has to be some story. Grandpa Rudy now has the challenge of telling a story for getting the older son out of the picture. How are we going to knock him off? And so we have the story of Hagar. This is on page 47 of Father Gianni's book. The bottom of page 47. We'd like to read for us the story of Hagar.
Oh,
Go for it, Adrian.
Sarah said to Abraham, I entrusted my servant to you, but now that she is pregnant, she looks on me with contempt. Abraham replied, she is your servant. Do with her as you please. Sarah then mistreated Hagar, so much that Hagar fled from Sarah. The angel of God found Hagar near a spring of water in the desert and said to her, Hagar, where have you come from, and where are you going? She replied, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress. The angel said to her, return to your mistress and trust that your descendants will be multiplied. They will be so numerous that you will not be able to count them. You will give birth to a son and name him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your cry. He will dwell over against all his siblings. Hagar called God, who had spoken to her through the angel. You are the God of vision, for truly I have seen the one who looks after me. Sometime later, Hagar gave birth to a son named Ishmael.
Wow. So let's just back up a moment and figure out why Grandpa Rudy was telling these kinds of stories. The whole Abraham story was a way for us to understand how it is that we and our neighboring cultures, they're so much like us. This is the Near Middle East now, the ancient Near Middle East, these various Semitic cultures. We're kind of like them, but we're also different from them. They look like us. They do many of the same sorts of things. Some of them worship like us. So how do you explain that we are similar, but yet we're different? And what was Grandpa Rudy's way of explaining that? That we all descended from the same spiritual ancestors long ago. But the only challenge was that, in the same way that different children are different ways, the different tribes that came from these children are a little different. In fact, we referred to them as the 12 tribes. Remember that? And so these 12 tribes were all the children of Israel, who actually received a new name before his name was Israel. What was his name before his name was Israel? While you're thinking about that answer, think about what two letters Israel ends with. Israel ends with an E-L, which is the Hebrew word for God. Oh, because this story that we're about to, that Adrian just read is about Ishmael, which ends with which two letters? E-L, which in Hebrew means God. All of these significant names. So, okay, these 12 tribes were the tribes of Israel, the children of Israel. What was Israel's name before he was Israel? That was Jacob. Do you remember when or how he was renamed Israel? It happened after a fight. Who did he fight with? God. Or an angel of some sort. Again, it's some sort of spiritual. In the stories that Grandpa Rudy told, Jacob wrestled with God or an angel who came down to earth, and after they wrestled all night long, with no one person winning over the other, God or the angel, whomever it was that he was wrestling with in the dark, dislocated his hip, and gave him a new name, Israel. It was also Jacob, Israel, who had that great vision that Father Gianni talked about last night of that stairway to heaven. We call it Jacob's ladder in some Negro spirituals. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. But instead of thinking of these angels going up and down on a ladder, as Father Gianni explained, it was more like a stepped pyramid. If you go to the pyramids in Mexico, you'll notice that from far away they look like pyramids, but the closer you get up to them, even in Egypt, they're really just steps. So imagine all these angels walking up and down the staircase to heaven. That was the vision that Jacob or Israel had. Jacob's parents, what were Jacob's parents' names? His mom was Rebecca and her husband Isaac. And Isaac's parents' names were Sarah and Abraham. So in this complicated genealogy, Abraham and Sarah gave birth to Isaac, who married Rebecca. They gave birth to Jacob, who received the new name of Israel. And he's the one who had all the kids. That was our way of explaining how all these different people, these different tribes came from. We're so similar, and yet we're so different. That's those of us who are more similar. Let's talk now about this other group that's like very different. These people are very different from us. How do you explain that we're so similar? We're similar to them in certain ways. I mean, we're all human beings, but they're so different from us in what they believe and what they do. How do we explain that? From the story of Ishmael. Yes, Abraham and Sarah gave birth to Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah gave birth to Jacob, which had all of these children. So that's why all of us seem to be so related. This other group came from Abraham and not Sarah, but Abraham and his maidservant Hagar. So far, so good? Do you know which major world religion says that they descend from Hagar? That would be Muslims. Islam.
Mm-hmm.
The religion of Islam, what do we call people who are part of the religion of Islam? Muslims. Claim their spiritual lineage goes back through Ishmael. And so in this story that Father Gianni talks about, what we have this fascinating story where Sarah says, "Hey, baby, if you're going to have descendants, you may as well do the deed with Hagar." But then the story picks up with Hagar now being pregnant, and Sarah saying to herself, "What did I do?" And so Sarah mistreated Hagar so much that Hagar fled from Sarah. Who provides Hagar relief or support in her despair? That would be the angel of God. The angel of God found Hagar near a spring of water in the desert and said to her, "Hagar, where have you come from and where are you going?" Of course, the angel of God already knows the answers. But we have these fascinating stories that Grandpa already told of angels coming down from heaven to be able to interact with human beings. Hagar said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress, Sarah." The angel said to her, "Return to your mistress, Sarah, and trust that your descendants will be multiplied." Isn't it true that sometimes in our lives we find ourselves like Hagar, somehow not where we thought we'd end up? You know, Hagar thought that she'd be with at least somewhere near Abraham with all of her children and their grandchildren and all their descendants, and somehow life had taken her another direction now where she found herself out in the wilderness. Interestingly, as Father Gianni says later in this book, the wilderness is a place of encounter in the scriptures. And who does Hagar encounter in the wilderness? The angel of the Lord, the angel of God. The angel said to her, "Trust that your descendants will be multiplied. They will be so numerous that you will not be able to count them. You will give birth to a son and name him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your cry." What does that tell us? Even those of us who don't speak Hebrew, Ishmael. Why do you get the name Ishmael? The Lord has heard your cry. Ishmael is a name meaning God hears. Hagar called to God who had spoken to her through the angel and said, "You are the God of vision, for truly I have seen the one who looks after me." Hagar gave birth to a son named Ishmael.
Father Jayme.
Please.
God of vision, what we translate there, is El Roi,
Uh,
and Hagar is the only character in the entire scriptures to ever give God a name. And really, we could better translate that as the God who sees me. So it's a person in pain and suffering who gives God a name and feels seen, heard.
the God who sees me, even in my despair, in my pain, in my hurt, in my suffering. So what a beautiful story we have of how it is that God is present through God's angels to us in despair. Father Gianni points out how it is that God sent the angel to protect and comfort Hagar, so thus giving us the hope. You know, as Christians, we look for stories that give us hope as well. If God could send an angel to comfort Hagar, then who are we to think that God would not do the same for us somehow, even in the darkest moments of our lives, or in the darkest moments of the lives of those around us? So think about that. If you need to comfort someone in despair, there's a great story you can share of how it is that God sent the angel of God to Hagar. Terry, you had raised your hand to read. We're getting ready for the story of Mark on page 49. If you want to run your eyes over that story, and we'll come back to that in just a moment here. But in this story, we have this great story of Hagar, whose life was not as linear as she thought it was. You know, and sometimes we think that life is going to be this easy, straight line. When we make New Year's resolutions, I don't know about y'all, I've made New Year's resolutions before, and 3 weeks later, I'm already off track, off course. Hagar had one vision for herself, and she found herself derailed from that. And that's why these stories are so important. The story that we have on Mark, then, that Terry Ann will hopefully read out for us, then, is a story of a young man who's a musician thinking, I'm going to be a famous musician. What I love about the story is we listen to it. Let's really take our time reading and listening to this story, because Mark has a dream of being a musician, and others encourage him such that he's thinking, here I am now, and I'm just shortly going to be over here. And unfortunately, life is not always that linear, that straight. So Mark is going to find himself over here, and then over there, and over there. And is he ever going to be a musician who's filling stages like Lady Gaga or whoever the most current artists are? So we hear the story of Mark, Tyrion.
Hagar's despair reminds me of the defeat felt by my friend Mark. Since he was a child, Mark's passion was music. He played the guitar and piano, and he wrote songs that he initially sang for friends, then performed in local pubs, in the streets, and at village festivals. His popularity spread by word of mouth, and the local record company convinced him to invest his family's savings into the recording and release of an LP record, a springboard to his success. The small record company boasted a certain credibility, as it had launched the careers of other musicians who had become famous, and Mark harbored the desire to one day leave his job as a mechanic to become a professional singer.
If you don't mind just pausing there, Terry Ann. So we already get the setup of the story here. What I love about Father Gianni's book is he tells these stories. He'll talk to us about angels in the Bible, and then he'll tell the story of someone who's experienced angels in some way. So here we have a mechanic. So just to sort of like think about the people who you know, that there could be a Mark in your life. So someone who has, the work that they do to support themselves. In Mark's case, he was a mechanic, but at night he just loved making some music and writing songs. And he found a record company that made other people famous. And so he's thinking, it's a big step I'm taking here. It's a leap of faith, but I'm going to invest my family's savings in the production of an LP, a record, so that can be my springboard to success. So we already know that Mark is going to be a success, right? Terry Ann?
He soon realized that the success of songs depends not only on a musician's skills, but also on the broadcast of the music on the radio. He was told he needed to invest in a budget for the more frequent broadcasting of his music on the radio. Believing he was on the path to success, Mark couldn't stop. If he didn't invest in radio broadcasting, his previous investment in the recording and release of his LP would be for naught. The listener feedback was promising, and the record company suggested that Mark participate in the San Remo Music Festival, the largest annual Italian music competition, which was broadcast on the leading national television network. The festival organizers had decided to give space to young musicians, so this was Mark's moment. To join the festival, though, he would have to record an unreleased song with money he didn't have. Mark didn't care. He took out a loan and recorded his new single. The less than positive response came right before Christmas. The record company absolved itself from all responsibility, while Mark wondered why it didn't previously tell him how much money is required to establish oneself in the music industry. He was their client, but they lived on the dreams and money of musicians like him. Mark came to understand this too late. The discouragement of having failed in this venture and the thought of the debt to be repaid terribly depressed Mark, and music no longer brought him joy. The public enthusiasm for his first album had faded, and no one wanted to buy a CD with a single by a non-famous artist. Mark's depression lasted for months, and everything seemed useless and meaningless to him. His work at the mechanic shop grew routine and unbearable. He no longer socialized with friends. Having lost his way, he found himself disheartened and in a dark corner of life.
So do you see what Father Gianni is doing here? He's taking the story of Hagar and now placing it side by side with the story of Mark. Mark, like Hagar, is finding himself in a dark, dark spot. Mark has invested all of this money into an LP. Now the music company is saying, hey, by the way, if you want to become famous, you also have to invest in radio stations so that they play your music. And so he's already had this sunk cost of an LP, so he's figuring, well, if I'm going to become famous, if I'm going to get from here to there, well, then I need to spend more money that I don't have. And by the way, Mark, while you're spending money, you also have to be part of this music festival that's coming up, and they need you to record an original song with money you don't have. And so now Mark, suddenly, who had this dream of being from here to there, as if life were that easy, now finds himself in a whole other place, deceived, heartbroken, depressed. Music no longer gives him joy. Terry Ann?
One day, I asked Mark if he would play at an evening event that I was organizing and which would certainly bring together a lot of people. Though unenthusiastic, he accepted my invitation, largely due to our childhood bond of friendship. Fortunately, the evening proved to be a great moment for Mark's morale. That night, we enjoyed a lengthy conversation, and Mark shared with me his whole story. I told Mark that he could still achieve his dream, since it was he who built the wall that now blocked him from his deepest desires. Due to his inexperience, Mark clung to the delusion that his climb to success would be quick, like drinking a glass of water. When the glass was empty, he muttered, my dream disappeared. It was absolutely necessary for Mark to begin visualizing again the life he wanted as a musician, happy and sharing his talent with the widest possible audience. To do so, though, he had to positively frame his story, raise his spiritual frequency, and open himself to the energy and grace of God's angelic spirits. I really don't know how the angels can guide me to success, he said. With loans to be repaid, I have no money for the recording and launch of a new album, but it doesn't hurt to try. His hope now balanced his doubts, which was a starting point.
I just want to pause there because the one phrase that jumps out at me from that paragraph is how it is that Mark thought that the climb to success would be quick, like drinking a glass of water. I'm betting that that's an Italian expression that doesn't translate well into English, but how it is that To get from here to there, being a famous musician, oh, that'll be easy. Like drinking a glass of water. Think of how quickly you can drink a glass of water. Ready, set, go. And Mark was thinking that it was going to be, achieving success in music was going to be that easy. And so here we have Mark, who's all disheartened and delusioned and is ready to give up on music entirely until Father Gianni reached out to him to play in an event, which he considered to do, and they get talking. And here it's part of the human journey, that it's not always easy to get to where we want to go, especially the bigger and the more lofty our dreams are, the more difficult it is to get there. It's going to take time. Not going to be something you can achieve overnight, Mark. Terry-Ann?
A few weeks later, Mark invited me to spend an evening by the sea at a party where he was performing. As we sipped a drink on the beach under the stars, Mark told me that he had organized a dozen small performances in clubs along the Italian Riviera, just as he used to do. It's as if a voice inside me told me to get busy, to work hard, to pay off my damned debt, and to keep performing. So I approached the club owners and, you know what? They all said yes. Mark exploded with a big laugh, filled with all the excitement of his newfound enthusiasm.
Awesome. We'll conclude the story.
The new release of his next LP had to wait for a few years. When it was ready, he shared it with several singers, asking for their opinions and advice. Some responding, complimenting him, and offering valuable suggestions. After searching for a long time, Mark signed a contract with a record company in Rome. Certainly not cheap, but it greatly contributed to the promotion of his music. For the first time, a record company has proposed to produce a new album for Mark at no expense to him, but with a contract that shares the proceeds from sales. Mark recently visited me and asked, "What would you think if I wrote a song about the angels?" I replied, "They would be elated."
Don't you love how that story turns out? Turns out sort of like the Hagar story, how it is that this woman who found herself in this dark moment of despair, found a way that she was going to achieve the happiness that she dreamed of for herself. Before we come to the next page, page 52, which is the story of Elijah, and we'll look in Amanda's direction for the story of Elijah. But before we get there, what I like in this chapter is that Father Gianni talks about how it is that in this journey, which is life, not everything is quick, like drinking a glass of water, but how it is that some things take time. In other fields, we refer to it as the law of the harvest. If you plant a seed one day, you're not going to go out and reap the harvest the next day. It's going to take time. And so figuring out, okay, what do you have to do now? From the time that you plant that seed until the time that you harvest, there are just certain things that you have to do over and over and over again. From the time that my canna lilies start coming up through the soil in the spring until November when I cut them off for the year, if I want them to still be flowering come September, October, November, what do I have to do? I have to water them and find ways to continue caring for them throughout the year. Success doesn't come quickly like drinking a glass of water. Success is a journey. And so Father Gianni talks in this chapter about how it is that the next section is called Feed Your Soul, how it is that we need to find ways to nourish ourselves on this journey. Which is why Father Gianni starts thinking about, because this book is called Angels in the Bible and in Your Daily Life, he's thinking about another story in the Bible that talks about a person on a journey who needs to find ways to nourish him or herself. In this case, it's the story of Elijah. We all know the story of Elijah. We heard it actually earlier this summer about how it is that Elijah arrived at a very dark place in his life where he was just ready to throw in the towel and to call it quits. And then, as we'll see in the story, things turn around. Amanda, do you mind reading to us the story of Elijah? Yep.
Elijah went a day's journey into the wilderness and sat beneath a tree. Wishing to die, he said, "It is enough, O God, take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Elijah lay down and fell asleep. But behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." Elijah looked up and saw a cake, baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank, then went to sleep again. The angel of God returned, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, lest the journey be too great for you." Elijah got up, ate, and drank, and with the strength of that food he walked 40 days and 40 nights to the mountain of God. There he entered a cave to spend the night, and behold, the Lord passed by. There was a strong driving wind that split the mountains and broke the rocks into pieces, but God was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire came a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he covered his face with his cloak, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him saying, "What are you doing, Elijah?"
Have we all heard the story before? We had it a bit earlier in the summer. It was a first reading that we had. But what this does is it combines, Father Gianni is combining two stories here. The story starts off with Elijah being discouraged and ready to give up. In the story, he says, "It is enough, O God, take my life." When I was a young seminarian, we had someone come talk to us once who said, "Why do people commit suicide?" If you know of anyone who's ever committed suicide or thought about committing suicide, it's because they have lost hope. Here we hear Elijah having lost, or in a very dark place of losing hope. "Lord, take my life. I'm done with this. I'm done with this suffering." And so in this story, we have Elijah lying down, falling asleep. And who comes to his aid in that moment? An angel. An angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." Elijah looked up and saw a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank, then went to sleep again. The angel of God returned, touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He got up and ate, and with that, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights. Again, the Bible is not a book of history, it's a book of theology. These are symbolic numbers, meaning the Lord gave him the strength. The Lord gave Elijah the strength that Elijah needed to get to God's mountain, which according to the story was a journey of 40 days and 40 nights. Thankfully, not a journey of 40 years. But again, we find, Father Gianni points out in this book, how it is that the wilderness is a place of spiritual encounter. So when Jesus goes to pray, does he go to the temple to pray? Jesus goes off into the wilderness to pray. Here we find Elijah in the wilderness, this place of spiritual encounter, where the angel comes to him and tells him to nourish himself so that he'll have the strength to make it to God's mountain. What I love about this book, Father Gianni's book, The Angels in the Bible in Your Daily Life, is that if I had written it, I would probably have stopped the story right there, because the story is told. The angel told Elijah to get up and to nourish himself, and he did so for 40 days and 40 nights. He continued on to the mountain of God, Horeb or Sinai. But Father Gianni continues the story. Do you see the second half of that story? It's a whole different story, but I think it's very important because it speaks of Elijah's encounter with God. The angel of the Lord nourished Elijah so that Elijah would have the strength that Elijah needed to get to God's mountain and to encounter God. And did God come to Elijah in the way that Elijah expected? In that story, we hear there was a strong, Elijah's now spending the night in the cave on that mountain, Horeb, or Sinai if you prefer. There's a strong driving wind that split the mountains and broke the rock into pieces. God was in that wind, right? God was not in that wind. After the wind came an earthquake. God was in the earthquake, right? God was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire. God was in the fire, right? God was not in the fire. After the fire came a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he covered his face with a cloak. Why did Elijah cover his face with the cloak when he heard the whisper? Because that was God. God doesn't always come to us in the way that we imagine. Think of the ancient peoples. They imagined God coming down as like one of them, as like one of the religious leaders or military leader of their day. You can imagine their surprise when God did not come among them like that. God came in the form of a boy born in the middle of the sticks of the boondocks of the Roman Empire. God doesn't always appear in the way that we imagine God is going to appear. As Father Gianni points out, that Elijah, we see in this story this transformation from Elijah, who was desperate and in despair, to one who was nourished physically and spiritually to be able to encounter God in the end of the story. Page 53, Father Gianni writes, the path toward creating the life you deserve requires the constant nourishment of your soul. In the same way that we nourish our physical body, we need to nourish our spiritual health as well. We all know what it's like to not eat for a day or two, right? You don't eat for a day, it's not the end of the world, but we're hungry. Don't eat for 2 days, that's serious. What about the nourishment of our spiritual health? Right? We often think about feeding ourselves physically. What about feeding our soul, feeding our spirit? The ways that we do that. So what I love about this is that Father Gianni, beginning on page 54, talks about different spiritual meals, if you will, ways that we can feed ourselves spiritually. We're on page 54. What's the first spiritual meal? Meditation. Which in plain words for us is simply finding a time when we can withdraw from all the action of the world to be alone and to experience some peace, to breathe, right? To clear our mind of everything else that's racing, all those thoughts that are racing through our minds, and simply breathe and be present and invite God into that moment of meditation, of mindfulness, of prayer. Meditation is different from rote prayers. You know, as Catholics, we're used to like clicking through rosary beads, and prayer for us becomes, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will. That's not meditation. Meditation is just being quiet, quieting ourselves, and listening for that whisper, if you will. There's a line in scripture that I really like. It's, be still and know that I am God. And every time my childhood pastor would say that, he would drop a word off it every time he would say it. He would say, this is how he would say it. He would say, and the scriptures tell us, be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know that I. Be still and know that. Be still and know. Be still and be still. Be. I think it's quite ingenious that we're called human beings, not human doings. I don't know about y'all, but in life I often find myself being a human doing, right? Busy, 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 act, act, act. Meditation is about us just being, about us slowing down and being with God. Second spiritual meal, bottom of page 54, thanksgiving and entrusting ourselves to our angelic spirits. Thanksgiving, simply, it's a day that we celebrate in November, but essentially Thanksgiving is an attitude to think about what are the things that I'm grateful for. One way that we nourish ourselves spiritually is to think about how grateful we are. Thank you, Lord, for, think of all the things you could finish that sentence with. If you were to take out a notebook, you could fill pages, I bet, with the things that you could be thankful for. What if you didn't have some of those things? Thank you for life. Thank you for health. Thank you for the food that we've enjoyed, the time that we've enjoyed during this retreat. Thank you for Father Gianni. Thank you for Father Roy and Father Brett and all the other, Father Deacon Elsa, all the other clergy who nourish us. Thank you for all the community here at Holy Family and the gifts of all the lay leaders. We could go for pages and pages thinking of things to be grateful for. It just seems that that's a sign of spiritual health. When we start growing bitter, I have a feeling that's because we've lost sight of the many things we could be grateful for. Page 55, third spiritual meal. Listening to biblical stories. I think that's one of the treasures of this book, is that Father Gianni introduced us to various stories that can nourish our souls, so that when we find ourselves in moments of despair, we can think about people like Hagar or Elijah, and we can be able to nourish others with those stories as well. You come across someone who's going through a dark moment, hey, I got two stories for you, Hagar and Elijah. Let me tell you their stories. You're not the first person to be feeling this way. Fourth spiritual meal, prayer, which opens us to eternity, he says. In reality, you are already praying as you pursue the path that nourishes your soul and raises your energy. Having a grateful soul, open to listening, is an authentic prayer to God. Fifth spiritual meal, the repetition of positive affirmations. You know, we create ourselves and our future in so many ways. We have to decide what messages we're telling ourselves. Right? Are you telling yourself, oh, I'm such an idiot, I always screw that up? Or are you telling yourself a more positive message in moments like that? I like Father Gianni's image in that paragraph. Just as a magnifying glass captures the sun's rays and is capable of generating fire and heat, the energy of our prayer and positive thoughts is focused through the calm, trusting repetition of positive affirmations. It's actually at the bottom of page 55 then that Father Gianni talks about that imagery of the wilderness or the desert, which I think is ingenious, because as Catholics and as Christians, we hear those stories of Jesus so many times. Jesus being out in the wilderness. Father Gianni is the one who reminds us that anytime there are stories that are told in the wilderness, that wilderness is a place of spiritual encounter. So where does Jesus go to pray for 40 days and 40 nights? Into the wilderness or the desert. Sometimes it's translated wilderness or sometimes desert. They both mean the same thing. Where did Moses and the people wander for 40 years? In the wilderness or in the desert. So there are all of these stories of the spiritual significance of wilderness. Father Gianni writes, it's an environment of danger and of death and countless dangers, including hunger and thirst, sandstorms and snakes, all of them threatening. Even in ancient Egyptian mythology, the god of fertility, Osiris, was opposed with the ruthless hostility by Seth, the god of the desert. There's life and there's the desert. Father Gianni brings to mind Jesus being in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan, where he was with the wild beasts. And was he out there all alone? Who took care of him? The angels served him. The next page, page 57, when very difficult moments occur in life, like the sudden loss of a loved one, the failure of a business venture that would have otherwise affirmed your potential, or the betrayal of your best friend, remember that the angels know everything, including the painful path you are traveling. Angelic spirits are with you to serve you, consoling you in times of distress, just as they consoled Hagar and just as they nourished Elijah. We'd like to read the next pericope for us from the Gospel of Luke chapter 22. We have the story of Jesus in the Mount of Olives. Who are you guessing is going to comfort him in the Mount of Olives? You guessed it. Becky?
Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives, as was his custom, and his disciples followed him. When he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not fall into temptation." Then Jesus walked about a stone's throw away from them, fell to his knees, and intensely prayed. Then there appeared to him an angel from heaven to comfort him.
What a beautiful image. That not only in this chapter does Father Gianni give us the image of Hagar, despairing in the desert, Elijah wanting to give up on life. Lord, it is enough. Take my life. But now Jesus, on the night before he died, found himself in the depths of despair. Imagine for a moment knowing that your life would be over tomorrow. Jesus found himself in the depths of despair, and yet God comforted him. Then there appeared to him an angel from heaven to comfort him. Before we come to the story of Sandy at the bottom of the page, maybe we look at Sister Maria's direction for the story of Sandy in a moment. Before we come to that story, I just want to reflect on how it is that what I love about Father Gianni's book is that it gives us a resource which, as it suggests, angels in the Bible and in your daily life, speaks of angels in the Bible, comforting people like Hagar and Elijah and Jesus, but it's also relating it to our daily lives as well, because ultimately this book is not about Hagar so many centuries ago, some 3,800 years ago. Ultimately, it's not about Elijah more than 2,000 years ago. It's not even about Jesus so much as it's about, okay, what do these stories mean for us today? So we hear the story of Sandy, Sister Maria.
Sandy was initially very private about her experience with angelic spirits. After earning her graduate degree in educational psychology with a focus on specific learning disabilities, Sandy found work at an education center that led trips for people with challenges within Sandy's field of expertise. From the start, her work was hardly educational or pedagogical. She was evaluated on her sales, and despite promises made, she didn't directly work with those in need. Sandy increasingly lost interest in her work until she was tempted to resign to pursue opportunities more aligned with her studies and passion.
So Father Gianni setting up a story. Sandy has graduated with her degree in educational psychology. She knows all about learning disabilities. So you can imagine how excited she is to have her first job out of college now with a company that works with people with various learning disabilities. But she finds herself not working with those people so much as she's in the office, and the focus for them, for her, their focus for her is that she make sales. That's not where her passion is. Sister Maria?
One winter day, early in the morning, Sandy went for a walk on the beach. She needed to clear her mind before beginning her usual workday at the office. Light began to dawn through the thick fog, which seemed to merge with the water. Sandy felt like she was immersed in a cloud, and only the crash of the waves and the shore reminded her that she was at the edge of the expansive sea. Sandy felt surrounded by a deep sense of mystery, leading her to an incredible inner serenity. A ray of sunlight then illuminated the surreal panorama, and Sandy could feel the heat of the sun on her face. She suddenly realized that she needed to let her face shine, so as to show the world what love is capable of doing. Great enthusiasm filled her soul, but was quickly transformed into a terrible sense of discouragement, resulting in real tears.
Just want to pause and recognize the images that Sandy's experiencing here. So in this, Sandy's walking on the beach. Light is beginning to dawn through the fog. It's a great image sort of for life's journey at times. Sometimes we feel like we're going through a dark night of the soul. to use the image of St. John of the Cross, or that we're like going through fog, but then, sometimes there's a little light that comes into that situation. Because when we talk about angels, we're not necessarily talking about winged figures. Remember, angels are nothing but spiritual beings of some sort. They can take all sorts of forms. As Father Gianni has suggested, they can take the form of light or anything else. So it's almost like, God's light coming into any situation. Since that morning, Sister Maria?
Since that morning, she says, I know more than ever what to do with my life, and it certainly doesn't involve staying in the office until retirement. I want to use my skills to help people who are experiencing difficulties, though I don't yet know how. I told Sandy about the support and enlightenment that we receive from the angels. Sandy immediately recalled how God's angels seemed to guide her during her solitary walk on the foggy beach, giving her the strength and desire to rise and shine like the sun. To do this, she had to nourish her soul and regain confidence in herself and in the opportunities that the universe would offer her. Sandy began to research the possibility of starting her own business, to share her advice and services. Activating all the contacts she had made, she finally understood that her work hadn't been a waste of time, but was instead a training on how to independently manage her own business. Sandy created a website and printed business cards. After hearing the complaints of her employer that she could now take customers away from the business, Sandy decided to cut ties and resign from her position. Sandy now happily works as a home-based educational psychologist. Her schedule is full, and her competence and sensitivity are highly appreciated. She often starts her day with a short walk on the beach, and, weather permitting, she sits for a while and meditates on the edge of the sea. She always thanks the angels who guided her toward the wonderful life that she is creating. I feel the angels of God helping me. When I meditate, I feel cared for and comforted, and I find surprising opportunities open for me. Above all, I'm happy with my work and the contact that I have had with people. I don't call them patients who have come to me for help. Amid the thick fog in which she found herself, Sandy returned to herself, refocused on what she really wanted, and with the help of angelic spirits, has moved forward despite obstacles and temptations. The dawn of Sandy's success now illuminates the horizon of her life.
Hi, what a great image. Amid the thick fog, Hagar found herself in the midst of a thick fog. Elijah found himself in the midst of a thick fog. Jesus found himself even in the midst of a thick fog, figuratively. And yet in those moments, God and God's angels are with us to support us in our despair. We'll open up for any comments or thoughts. Do we hear Father Gianni talking about how the angels support us in despair? Any stories of despair from our own lives and the ways in which God has provided us support through the angel in our lives?
I don't have a story, but I'm always finding myself telling Jaden that she should adopt an attitude of gratitude. Because she's always coming up with, some sort of negative something or other. Jaden, be more gratuitous about things, Jaden, even more positive about things. So I always tell her, Jaden, attitude of gratitude.
Attitude is so important. What messages do we give ourselves and others? And there will always be ways that we can find. We can always critique or find things to complain about in any situation about any single person. Is there a way to reframe that, in a way of gratitude? We're hardly ever grateful for that person who stands on our last nerve. But maybe there's a way to reframe that and say, thank you, Lord. I'm growing in all of this. As Sister Teresa Kernke was fond of saying, we earn our salvation through one another. Lord, thank you for this person. This person is helping me to earn my salvation. This person is helping me to learn patience. Final words on despair. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and forever shall be, a world without end. Amen. Let's get a quick breath of fresh air, and we'll be right back.